Coming up on this edition of the Vinyl Reacquisition Project, I'll be going into depth on classic metal albums from Abattoir, Twisted Sister, Running Wild, Virgin Steele, Saxon, and Napalm Death. Stay tuned. When you think of heavy music from Los Angeles in 1985, speed metal might not be the first thing that comes to mind. While the first wave of glam pretty much dominated the City of Angels at the time, you might have missed Abattoir, whose fusion of blistering riffs and power metal sensibilities were the furthest thing from the lipstick and hairspray bands. And yeah, I know, Slayer, Armored Saint, Megadeth, blah blah blah. But comparatively, those LA bands were outliers to what music was clearly popular in that scene. And even if others knew them at the time, it's likely only the serious indie metal fans would also know about Abattoir, let alone have any familiarity with their music. Officially formed in 1978, Abattoir would drift through lineups until 1982, when they made their way onto the Metal Massacre 4 compilation album, featuring a pre-Agent Steele John Cyrus on vocals and Juan Garcia on guitar. Nice typo, Metal Blade. If interested in Cyrus and Garcia in particular, I cover Agent Steele's second album, Unstoppable Force, in the last episode of this show. Check that out for more info on them. One additional fact about Juan Garcia is he did perform on Vicious Attack, but his name was yanked from the credits by the label, likely stemming from his exit to Agent Steele 9 months before this album's release. Speaking of the label, Combat Records picked up Abattoir after hearing their 2-song demo, the same demo that previously caught the attention of Metal Blade Records to put them on that Metal Massacre comp. It probably didn't hurt that the demo was produced by Bill Metoyer, who is pretty much the in-house producer at Metal Blade and had already produced albums for a number of known bands, such as Trouble, Slayer, and Tyrant. Recommended tracks include Stronger Than Evil, Don't Walk Alone, and Screams from the Grave. The funny thing is that the Vicious Attack album is basically a demo, which might explain its runtime of 27 minutes. Since the band didn't have a lot of money and Combat didn't want to spend a cent on re-recording the material, it was more or less left as is. Whether that's a good or bad thing is up to the listener. Personally, I feel the material holds up. The most recent vinyl reissue of Vicious Attack was on Back on Black Records in 2010 on 180-gram black vinyl, and with a gatefold jacket, limited to 1,000 copies. While their follow-up album would see a change in vocalists, as well as the band headed into a more melodic direction, Vicious Attack remains a raw and thrashy underground classic. Check it out. The debut album from New York's Twisted Sister didn't initially hit home with American fans. But across the pond, it was a smash and helped build a serious following amongst UK fans. Strange, right? Twisted Sister's history goes back to their initial formation in 1973, when the band wasn't the heavy metal band they later became, so I won't go through all of that. For that story, check out the 2014 documentary on the band, We Are Twisted Sister, an excellent and extensive history on the band, especially the early years. So let's begin in 1981. At this point, the band was wanting to get out of the club scene in the tri-state area, but were also wanting to concentrate on writing better songs. They were also wanting to get signed to a label. After being passed over by the majors and even some indies, the band self-released singles for the tracks I'll Never Grow Up Now and Bad Boys of Rock and Roll, along with the 1981 demo. And although American media wasn't picking up on these, the music journalists over in England very much were. Most notably, the music newspaper Sounds, who were already covering punk and other outsider musical forms. As a result, a British punk label by the name of Secret Records took an interest in them, so much so that their owner flew to New York to see the band play. Impressed with what the owner saw, Twisted Sister was soon after signed to Secret and flown back to England to record Under the Blade. Favorites are What You Don't Know Sure Can Hurt You, Under the Blade, and of course, Destroyer.
He takes it all he sees. Nothing escapes his gaze. And when he
The original version of this album was produced by UFO bassist Pete Way, who gave it a raw and aggressive sound befitting of the material. There's even a solo from Motorhead guitarist Fast Eddie Clarke on the track Tear It Loose. Later in 1985, when Twisted Sister was signed to Atlantic, that label remixed and reissued the album with a very different and more polished sound, and a slightly different cover image. Which version do you prefer? Let me know in the comments below. Perhaps the biggest turning point for Twisted Sister was on December 17th, 1982, when they performed live on the upstart British music television program The Tube on Channel 4. So by this point, Secret Records had already been dissolved, and the band was looking for a new label. But while performing their 20-minute set on the show, a representative for the UK office of Atlantic Records showed up, saw the reaction of the audience, particularly when Lemmy from Motorhead came on stage to jam with the band, and Twisted Sister was signed. If you haven't seen the episode already, do check it out on YouTube. The performance is fantastic. The most recent vinyl reissue of Under the Blade was on Back on Black in 2011 as a 2 LP set on yellow vinyl, which also included the tracks from their previously released EP, Rough Cuts, as well as one live track from their Reading Festival appearance in the early 80s. So although the critics at the time were really brutal to Under the Blade, and of course it gained the ire of the PMRC in the mid-1980s, mostly for the lyrics to the title track, modern reviewers really dig this album. Perhaps Twisted Sister was a little ahead of their time. In any case, Under the Blade proves to be an aggressive and powerful debut, paving the way for their next 2 albums, which would finally give them the success in America they richly deserved. Before they were pirates, Germany's Running Wild put out a speedy and aggressive debut record, even predating the power metal sound for which they're much better known now. The record is also steeped in some rather satanic lyrical themes, material that some of the modern fans might not even know about. Sadly, the early Running Wild records sometimes get a little forgotten about. Running Wild dates back to 1979 after a name change from Granite Heart, though they say in interviews that they consider 1983 to be the real starting point for the band. And in case it's not entirely obvious, the band is named after the Judas Priest track Running Wild, following in the grand tradition of other bands who've done the exact same thing, such as Exciter, Rage, Sinner, and Steeler. 2 years after recording a demo, Running Wild tracked some rough versions of the songs Chains and Leather, as well as Adrian SOS, for the 1983 compilation album Rock from Hell, German Metal Attack. These tracks would also find their way onto the band's Heavy Metal Like a Hammer Blow demo. The following year, the band would record their Gates to Purgatory album for Noise Records. Notable songs include Victim of State's Power, Prisoner of Our Time, and Satan. And speaking of Satan, this track, as well as Walpurgis Night, were originally found on the Victim of State's Power EP, released shortly before Gates to Purgatory, but didn't appear on the original Noise Records pressing of the album. Rather, they were included on the US and Canadian pressings, Combat and Viper respectively, as bonus tracks. The 2 tracks later appeared when the album was reissued on CD in 1988. Also, you might have noticed that Walpurgis Night seems to cut out early, which is largely credited to the condition of the master tape for most releases. It is a little jarring to hear it though, it just stops. And true to their namesake, you can definitely hear the Judas Priest influence all over this album, notably on the opening riff to Soldiers of Hell. It's pretty obvious. Of course, I did mention the whole satanic lyrics thing. What's most amusing about that is that then guitarist for the band Gerald Warnicka, also known as Preacher, was a theology student at the time and later became an evangelical priest. So the guy nicknamed Preacher is now a preacher. Too funny. And it seems that some folks like to credit this band with being an influence on what would later become black metal, but lyrics aside, I'm not buying it. Bands such as Hellhammer and Bathory had a much more profound impact on both lyrical and musical content for those bands to come. The most recent vinyl reissue of Gates to Purgatory is the 2018 release from Noise Records in 180-gram vinyl and fully remastered. However, it is missing the 2 bonus tracks. Truth be known, this is my favorite era of Running Wild, both this record and their follow-up album, Branded and Exiled. And although the onset of their pirate metal shtick following this was entertaining, the band's further reach into melodic power metal ultimately left me cold. Still, these first two albums are classics, and both come recommended. The debut album from Virgin Steele was the brainchild of a guitar player who wanted to form the ultimate heavy metal band. Now, did he succeed? Well, Virgin Steele begins more or less in 1981, formed by guitarist Jack Starr, drummer Joey Avazian, vocalist David DeFay, and a pre-LA Guns Kelly Nichols on bass. Nichols was later replaced by Joe O'Reilly, completing the first album lineup. So this debut record is often credited as being the very first release by Music for Nations in Europe, but before that, it was originally self-released with a pressing of only 10,000 copies. This indie pressing is also referred to as Virgin Steele 1. Thankfully, this is the copy I have, and it's definitely a collector's item at this point. Speaking of Music for Nations, Virgin Steele signed with them in 1982, predating the joining on that label from other American bands such as Metallica, Wasp, and Manowar. Like Abattoir's debut effort, so too was Virgin Steele's first album meant to be a demo. The album that resulted in that session was recorded and mixed in 1 week for $1,000, and was a response to the good press the band got from tapes sent out to music magazines and the like. DeFay even sold the first 5,000 copies of the record from out of the trunk of his car. And of course, we have to talk about that album cover because it's amazing. In one single painting, you've got armored aliens, a blue space dragon, a giant mutant flower, and a spaceship emblazoned with the acronym NWAHM, no doubt standing for New Wave of American Heavy Metal. So Mr. Schmucker, whoever you are, I salute you and your weird art. Standout tracks are Danger Zone, Virgin Steele, and Children of the Storm. So despite the person who actually founded this band, it really is the product of David DeFay at this point. And there was even a lawsuit over the band name between DeFay and a now-fired Jack Starr. Starr ended up winning the dispute, but sold the name to DeFay anyways. Starr was already in the process of working on his solo album, so nothing was really lost from the termination. Virgin Steele also gets credited with being one of the originators of US power metal. And while I would say there is some truth in that, far more accurate examples might be bands such as Manowar and Savatage. Still, Virgin Steele maybe deserves at least a little of the credit. The most recent vinyl reissue of Virgin Steele's first album was put out by No Remorse Records in 2018 in both black and red vinyl versions, the latter color limited to 100 copies. And DeFay still forges on with Virgin Steele. The most recent release is their 17th studio album, Gothic Voodoo Anthems, released by Steamhammer Records in 2018. You know, sometimes it's the second time that's the charm. And that's exactly what happened with the sophomore release from British metal titans Saxon, a record that not only climbed the charts, but it also helped define the genre. So right away, I feel a comparison needs to be addressed here between the first album of Saxon and the first album of Motorhead. And basically because I feel each of those albums is a bit of a false start for their bands. In addition to both bands being British and coming out of the same music scene, Saxon supported Motorhead on the latter's 1979 tour. Both bands also formed a friendship that lasted decades, even prompting Saxon to pen the track They Played Rock and Roll on their 2018 album Thunderbolt, a song about touring with Motorhead. The track is also dedicated to the late Lemmy Kilmister. Given that the second album from each band did a lot better than the first, and it can be argued that the follow-up albums are a lot closer to heavy metal than their predecessors, both Saxon and Motorhead effectively beat the sophomore jinx together, albeit 11 months apart. This is also the album that got Saxon charting in Britain, reaching number 5 on the UK Albums Chart, the highest charting album for the band to date. They were also on the bill for the first ever Monsters of Rock Festival in Castle Donington, a gathering dedicated to hard rock and heavy metal bands. Other bands Saxon played with at the festival include Rainbow, Judas Priest, The Scorpions, and others, with attendance reaching 35,000. Tracks to check out include Motorcycle Man, Street Fighting Gang, and the title track to Wheels of Steel. A music video was released for the track Susie Hold On, though promotional videos for the title track, as well as 747 Strangers in the Night, were also released. All 3 songs were also released as singles. The most recent vinyl reissue of Wheels of Steel is the 2018 release from BMG in limited edition gold and black swirl vinyl, which also comes with a printed inner sleeve and with lyrics. Wheels of Steel is often considered the first of 3 essential Saxon albums in a row from the classic era, alongside Strong Arm of the Law and Denim and Leather. All 3 of these are highly recommended, but also look into the modern releases from Saxon. Definitely worth checking out. The third album for British grindcore act Napalm Death is actually much more of a death metal album, one that would prove to become a true classic of that genre. Harmony Corruption also marks a number of firsts for the band. In addition to steering into a much more death metal direction than previous efforts, this is also the debut of former Benediction vocalist Barney Greenway, as well as the band changing from a 4-piece to a 5-piece, with the exit of guitarist Bill Steere, who went on to Carcass, and is being replaced by guitarists Jesse Pintado and Mitch Harris. Now, I do know that this album had its naysayers at the time, largely due to the band's stylistic changes. And it does seem that the band listened to those fans and somewhat changed back with their next release, which is a little questionable, to be honest. But I'll tell you, this is my favorite Napalm Death album, and for much of what some had a problem with. Of course, drummer Mick Harris had the biggest problem with the change, and it appears that this might be one of the chief reasons why he left Napalm to form his electronic music project, Scorn. But despite the disappointment within the band, this album did make it to the UK Albums chart in September of 1990, charting at number 67 for a single week. Preferred tracks include Unfit Earth, Mind Snare, and especially Suffer the Children.
Promises of sanctuary in eternal bliss, with starry eyes and cash in hand, pledge to the master plan.
And speaking of Suffer the Children, the track was made into a music video and also became the single from the album, with the B-side containing the then non-LP tracks Siege of Power as well as Harmony Corruption. Those B-side tracks would later find their way onto the 1991 compilation for the band entitled Death by Manipulation. And since I already mentioned Unfit Earth, I should also mention that the track has additional guest vocals on it, from Glenn Benton of Deicide as well as John Tardy of Obituary, both of whom elevate an already stellar track. Harmony Corruption went for a while without a vinyl reissue until Earache started repressing it in 2012, with the latest pressings in 2021 available in silver at 500 copies, as well as an unspecified number of black copies. Harmony Corruption is a death grind juggernaut, boasting better production and much tighter performances than on their previous albums. Among so many of the classic era Earache Records releases, this single album is very high on my list. You should definitely hear it. So let me know what you thought about these classic metal albums. Did you buy them when they were new, or did you get into them more recently? Also, let me know you might have favorite albums from these bands other than the ones I picked. I want to hear about all of that. Let me know that and anything else relevant in the comments below. Of course, if you enjoy this program, do give it one of these. Also, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Share the video with some friends. This is the Accusation Network, where each and every week I do videos on metal vinyl collecting, just like this one, but this isn't the only kind of video I do. I do lots of other types of shows in and around the subject. I do vinyl hauls, I do upcoming metal vinyl notices, I go to record stores, all that stuff. If you want to find out about that, you should definitely go to the playlists at my channel. Definitely tons of stuff there to check out. And if you've been with me for a little while and you want to support me in a more extended capacity, do check out my Patreon page. That's at patreon.com/theaccusationnetwork. I have a bunch of reward tiers there. I show videos up to 7 days earlier than I do here on YouTube. I have exclusive content. Definitely check out the site, check out the tiers, and see how you can contribute. And as always, see you next time.